All right, so, we're diving into some pretty intense stuff today, right? Like we're
Mm.
looking at this whole idea of, you know, a major global conflict possibly breaking out in 2025. And I think, it's easy to get swept up in, the doom and gloom of it all.
Yeah, for sure.
But, our aim here isn't to, just throw out a bunch of worst case scenarios. Like, we really want to dig into these sources you've brought, figure out what's really driving these tensions and, what could actually set things off. I think it's about getting a clearer picture, right? Without, getting bogged down in all the little details. And I think the main source we're looking at today is this analysis you've got that kind of maps out these potential, global conflict zones in 2025. So, yeah, I guess let's jump right in.
Sounds good. I think you were trying to sort of figure out, where things are going. It's always super helpful to look back a bit,
Yeah.
right? See what history can teach us.
Right.
Your source, it makes a good point about World War I and World War II. It's not about like memorizing dates or anything like that. It's more about understanding, the conditions that kind of led to these regional tensions, blowing up into huge global catastrophes.
Yeah, totally. And, the source kind of draws this straight line between, back then and now. Like it highlights these, these alliances forming, these huge economic downturns, and then these long-standing kind of regional disputes and how they all basically acted as like fuel for the fire, right? And it's like, think about those treaties they had before World War I, like how this super rigid system was set up where, one assassination could basically trigger this whole cascade of war declarations.
Right.
Or like the just total economic desperation after the Great Depression,
Yeah.
That unfortunately in a lot of countries, it really fueled these super aggressive policies, expansionist policies. It's like these weren't just isolated incidents. It's like, they were sparks landing on, a pile of dry tinder.
Exactly. It's like setting the stage, right? And I think what's so interesting and maybe a little bit, unsettling is that parallel the source points out with, the time period right before World War I is like this idea that back then a lot of people genuinely believed that the world had become too advanced, too interconnected through trade and economics to actually have another big war. It was almost like war had become unthinkable.
Yeah, and that really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, are we maybe making the same assumption today? Like, even with all the obvious tension and stuff going on, are we still kind of, lulled into this false sense of security? Like, because we have this interconnected global economy and all this technology, do we think that maybe we're somehow immune to, a major conflict? It's a big question to think about, especially as we're about to dive into these specific hotspots that the source flags, for 2025.
Definitely, yeah. And so, shifting gears to today, right? Like right now, the source identifies a bunch of these key areas where things are really tense and where things could potentially boil over, in 2025. And I think a good place to start is with the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Right.
Because it's been, this major source of instability since 2022. And like your source points out, NATO getting involved with military aid and sanctions, that definitely raises the stakes.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah, no doubt. It's like, the source uses this phrase. It's a pretty stark warning. It says, a single wrong move can spark a chain reaction.
Right.
That really drives home how fragile things are, how volatile this situation is. It's not just some, contained regional thing. It's like this huge web of global power dynamics where any miscalculation or any serious escalation in Ukraine, it could have consequences that spread far beyond the region itself.
Totally. And building on that whole interconnectedness thing, the source then goes on to talk about the China-Taiwan situation, which is another potential flashpoint.
Right.
You've got China being increasingly assertive militarily towards Taiwan, and at the same time, you've got the U.S. and its allies saying they'll support Taiwan. It's like this really direct and potentially explosive power struggle in the Asia-Pacific.
Yeah, this one feels really precarious. I mean, the source pretty much says outright that if China were to invade Taiwan, the U.S. would almost certainly respond.
Right.
And then it goes on to say that, that kind of response from the U.S., it would probably drag in a whole bunch of other countries. So you're talking about a regional conflict escalating into something way bigger. It's not hard to imagine how all these existing security pacts and alliances, how they could get activated in that kind of scenario.
Absolutely. And then we've got the Middle East, which is, well, always complex, right? You've got the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. You've got concerns about Iran's nuclear program. And then you've got Israel's, often pretty strong reactions to all of this. And the source is basically saying that there's a real chance of a regional war breaking out there.
Yeah.
And because of the Middle East's, strategic importance, when it comes to oil and all these international alliances, any war there could easily involve global powers.
It's like the Middle East has been this powder keg for, I don't know, decades, right? It's like all these different conflicts interacting, the proxy wars, the nuclear ambitions, countries from outside the region vying for influence. It all adds up to a situation that's just really unpredictable, where even small clashes could spiral out of control.
Yeah, it's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got North Korea, the whole nuclear threat there.
Right.
And the source expects them to keep doing these missile tests, a lot of them, in 2025. And it says there's a real possibility of confrontation, like direct confrontation, with South Korea, Japan, and obviously the U.S.
Yeah, North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons and just how unpredictable they are, it's been a constant source of anxiety globally, I think. And I think the source is right to point out that any kind of miscalculation or even just outright aggression in that region could have huge consequences, really devastating consequences, not just in the region, but, potentially for the whole world.
For sure. And that, to round out this kind of overview of current tensions, the source brings up cyber warfare and the space race.
Right.
And I think the main point here is that future conflicts, they might not start in the traditional way, with armies mobilizing and troops on the ground.
It's a fascinating, if kind of unsettling thought, right? Like, what if a major conflict actually starts in the digital realm, where you could cripple essential infrastructure, like power grids, financial networks, things like that? Or, the idea of space becoming strategically important, like whoever controls space controls communication, navigation, even defense. It's just a completely different way of thinking about war compared to those historical examples we talked about earlier.
Yeah, for sure. It's like a whole new battlefield. And, then the source kind of moves on to what it calls hidden triggers. These are factors that might not be as obvious as, geopolitical hotspots, but they can still play a huge role in escalating things towards a bigger conflict. And the first one it talks about is economic crises. It specifically points to the threat of global inflation, instability in oil prices, potential food shortages, that kind of stuff. And it basically reminds us that historically, there's been a link between economic hardship and countries becoming more aggressive, more nationalistic in their policies.
Yeah, like when people are struggling economically at home, it's easy to look for someone to blame, right? To find an external enemy. Or, maybe a country starts acting more aggressively to try to get hold of resources they need. It's like that kind of desperation. It breeds instability, and it makes countries trust each other less on a global scale.
Exactly. And then the second hidden trigger the source talks about is climate change. Like how climate change is leading to more conflict.
Right.
The source talks about essential resources like water becoming more scarce and more climate-related disasters happening, leading to mass migrations. And then all of that puts pressure on borders and resources, which can lead to conflict. And it actually uses a specific example. It talks about how tensions along the India-China border, they could be made worse by glaciers melting and changes in water availability, which is a pretty real-world example of how, environmental changes can have a big geopolitical impact.
Yeah, that's a powerful example. It shows how these environmental concerns, they're not just abstract things. Like, they have really concrete and serious impacts on international relations and global security. So, then the source gets a little more speculative. But it's still important stuff. It's like, okay, let's say a major global conflict does happen. What might that actually look like? What would the structure be? What would it involve? And one thing it talks about is the possibility of these big alliances forming, maybe something like NATO versus the BRICS countries. Although it's important to remember that, these aren't just, solid blocks with everyone on the same page.
Right. It's not like black and white, good guys and bad guys.
Exactly. But what the source is getting at is that, these existing power structures, they could solidify and align in the event of a big conflict. And that's kind of useful for understanding the potential scale and scope of something like that.
Definitely. And the source also talks a lot about what it calls, advanced warfare, like what would war look like with all the technology we have today. It talks about drones, cyber attacks on infrastructure, weapons in space, even AI being used in military operations.
Yeah.
It's a big shift from how wars were fought, in the past.
Like, it's a pretty chilling picture, isn't it? Like, not so much about traditional armies fighting on the ground, but more about remote-controlled systems, attacks happening in cyberspace that you can't even see, and control of space becoming super important. It's like a fundamental change in how we even think about war.
Totally. And then, of course, you can't really talk about global conflict without talking about nuclear weapons.
Right.
And the source gives us this really sobering statistic. It says there are over 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world today.
Wow.
And it emphasizes that even a single miscalculation or one escalation that leads to even one of these weapons being used,
Right.
it could be catastrophic, like unimaginable loss of life. And not just military personnel, but civilians too, on a scale we've never seen before.
Yeah, that number, 13,000, it's almost hard to even grasp. It's just this huge threat hanging over any conversation about large-scale war. And I think the source does a good job of reminding us that wars aren't just these abstract events. It's real people who suffer, civilians who get caught in the middle.
For sure. And, the source ends on a bit of a more hopeful note. It's like, okay, all this stuff is scary, but it's not a foregone conclusion. It's not inevitable. And it talks about how important things like diplomacy, peace talks, global cooperation, those things are essential for preventing a major conflict.
It's so important to remember that, right? That even when things seem really tense and like there's no way out, there's always the option of talking, of trying to de-escalate. And the source is right. We have to learn from history so we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Absolutely. And so, for you listening, after hearing all of this, after going through all these potential conflict zones, the hidden triggers, all of it, I'm curious, what do you think, what single factor out of everything we've talked about do you think is the most important to keep an eye on, to try to prevent a wider war, and why? It's a question that really makes us think beyond the headlines and really grapple with what's shaping the world and what might happen in the future.
It's a lot to think about, but, that's what we're here for.
Exactly.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.